Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore how and when love relationships succeed, which is a follow-up to my previous video on why love relationships fail. I'll put a link to that earlier video in the description section of this one. Anyhow, many thanks to 3 people for suggesting the topic for this video. First, Pendejo, the guy who originally suggested the whole topic of love relationships, and then YTube777 and my own wife, Nicole, for suggesting the more specific topic of success in love relationships. So yeah, many thanks to all of you for that idea. And as usual, here's a roadmap of the material in this video. And as usual, you can find the same roadmap in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Anyhow, before we begin, I should probably issue the same sort of disclaimer I did in my last video on love relationships. The material in this video will be coming mostly from my own personal perspective, which is that of a white, heterosexual American male born in 1960. And since the experience of individual human beings can vary so much, so too can the nature of our love relationships. Consequently, what is a resounding success in one person's eyes can easily be an abject failure in another's. As the old saying goes, one man's meat is another man's poison. And so, as in pretty much every other area of life, your own results and insights can vary with your own experience, as well as your own personal demographic niche. Anyhow, with all of that out of the way, in my experience, the bedrock foundation for any successful love relationships is always trust. The reason is that without trust, it's very difficult for us to have a love relationship in the first place. That's because genuine love relationships always involve a certain degree of openness to each other, which in turn entails a certain degree of vulnerability. And it's very difficult to be that open and that vulnerable with people we don't really trust. People who make us feel like we can't relax and just be ourselves. Because we always have to be on guard in one way or another. For instance, that's why abusive relationships, or ones with a significant history of lying, deception, and/or betrayal, are at best very difficult love relationships and are always prone to deterioration and failure. It's because without a basic sense of safety and trust, it's very hard for us to be open enough to experience any deep and abiding sense of love in the first place. But the thing about trust is that it's not something we can merely grant to each other by fiat. It's not just a matter of proclaiming our trust or our trustworthiness, because at some level, we all know that words can be a very cheap and insubstantial thing in this world. After all, we all know that pretty much every liar and con man in the world says, either implicitly or explicitly, "You can trust me. You know you can." In fact, when you think about it, that's almost a precondition for lying in the first place. But the hard reality of life is always, well, maybe I can trust you and maybe I can't. We'll have to see. And so, trustworthiness is not something we can simply assert in our relationships, but something we either earn or fail to earn through our acts and our presence to each other over time, mostly by consistently demonstrating our trustworthiness. And so, the very first essential step toward a successful love relationship is to establish, maintain, and safeguard that precious sense of trust and trustworthiness, because without it, the relationship is already problematic at best. But beyond trust, what else can we say about successful love relationships, especially in light of their vast diversity? Well, one description of successful relationships, and especially the type that help us grow as human beings, comes to us by way of the famous humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers. Of course, he's speaking specifically about successful psychotherapeutic relationships. But I find that his basic description is also not a bad template for understanding what makes our love relationships successful. Anyhow, the first attribute, according to Rogers, has to do with understanding, or what he calls empathy. And while that might sound at first like a platitudinous, self-evident truth, it actually gets pretty subtle and tricky in practice. The reason is that, contrary to popular opinion, actual understanding is a fairly rare thing in this world. The truth is that we hardly ever understand each other. Instead, what we're typically doing is judging each other and then mistaking our judgments for actual understanding. Basically, judgment has to do with evaluating each other according to various hierarchies, and it happens in many subtle and automatic ways. For instance, we judge other people according to what they look like, how they dress, how they talk, what kind of car they drive, what their political and religious affiliations are, whether they're short or tall, black or white, fat or thin, handsome or ugly. And no, it's not particularly fair, nor even necessarily accurate. But it's something we pretty much all do, whether we're aware of it or not. However, the fallacy is that none of that sort of thing adds up to actually understanding each other, at least not in any genuine or deep sense. Instead, genuine understanding is about seeing things from each other's perspective as much as we humanly can, rather than remaining safely immured within the high bastions of our own judgmentalism. It's about really seeing each other, really taking the time to perceive and appreciate each other's struggles, as well as each other's triumphs. Seeing all of that from the inside, as it were. It's about really honoring each other's distinct experience and unique presence in this life. And beyond that, it's about expressing all of that and letting each other know that we're being truly understood and not merely judged. And yeah, all things considered, those are probably relatively rare commodities in our world. But no matter how uncommon they are, they're exactly what's necessary for a successful love relationship. Well, at least in my experience. Basically, if we want our love relationships to flourish and succeed, at some point we need to step beyond the pale of our inevitable judgments and against all odds, start to understand each other instead. And if you're still not convinced of that, consider what a love relationship would be like without real understanding. What it would feel like not to be seen for who we really are, to remain always remote and distant in the deepest recesses of our hearts, always strangers deep down inside, always judged, perhaps positively sometimes and negatively at other times, but hardly ever seen and hardly ever heard, hardly ever really recognized when and where it matters most. Wouldn't that basically be, well, basically a snapshot of hell? Anyhow, according to Rogers, the second attribute of successful relationships has to do with acceptance. Basically, acceptance has to do with prizing each other for who and what we actually are. Of course, it's always an easy thing to accept the parts of each other that we find attractive, or at least tolerable. But that's not what makes acceptance a challenge, especially in our love relationships. What makes it a challenge is that pretty much of us are also bearers of the exact opposite of that. Bearers of darkness and ugliness, of weakness and mendacity, etc. Basically, none of us is a fully evolved bodhisattva, beatifically kind, generous, and enlightened at any and all points. And that fact is what makes acceptance a genuine challenge. God, wouldn't it be so much easier if it weren't that way? Well, yeah, it probably would be. But as in so many other areas of our lives, we're stuck having to deal with human reality and not the phantasmagoria of our idyllic daydreams. And so the question becomes, how can we learn to love each other despite our inevitable faults and shortcomings? How can we love each other in the very midst of our imperfections? And I suspect that a lot of that probably has to do with allowing our love to mature beyond needing everything to be perfect. Perhaps it has to do with finally realizing the wisdom of Voltaire's famous proclamation that the perfect is the enemy of the good. After all, if our love is fixated solely on what we find perfect in this world, well, then it's bound to remain an incredibly rare and elusive thing in our lives, and practically impossible to sustain over many years. And so I'd say that, like trust and understanding, acceptance is another necessary part of a successful love relationship. And finally, Rogers also says that honesty, which he describes in terms of a kind of transparency or congruence, is also part of a successful relationship. Basically, whereas empathy has to do with truly seeing each other, honesty has to do with allowing ourselves to be seen, with dropping our usual evasions, deceptions, and misdirections, both with regard to others and also with regard to ourselves. In that respect, honesty has to do with learning to live with a kind of simplicity, an almost childlike lack of trickery, guile, and artifice. So in summary, for Carl Rogers, successful psychotherapeutic relationships, and I would argue successful human relationships more generally, are characterized by empathy, acceptance, and honesty. However, that still leaves open the question about what other characteristics might help our love relationships succeed. And here I'd like to mention 4. First, kindness. Then, compromise and communication. Then, shared experience. And finally, appreciation and gratitude. Let's look at kindness first. Basically, kindness has to do with treating each other well, with our desire to better each other's lives. And here again, it's difficult to see how any love relationship that doesn't have an appreciable amount of kindness can be construed as a success. There are, of course, very unkind, even abusive relationships that sometimes drag on for years and sometimes even for decades. But then again, just because a relationship manages to limp along for many years doesn't automatically mean it's a success. In fact, sometimes relationships that are complete disasters are the ones that last the longest. But let's get back to kindness. Basically, kindness is a form of generosity, a desire to give whatever gifts we happen to possess to our partner, so that our partner's life is improved somehow, along with the relationship itself. And I'd say that it's often a very difficult lesson to learn, especially when we're young, that it doesn't really matter how attractive or sexy our partners are if kindness isn't a major part of the equation. Of course, sometimes the hard reality is that the gifts we possess aren't necessarily the ones our partners actually want. And as a consequence, it can be very difficult to be kind to our partners in a way that they can recognize and receive. In cases like that, where our gifts don't match what our partners want very well, I'd say that it might be better for the relationship to come to a relatively quick end. After all, life is far too short to be squandering our gifts on people who can't receive them, or who can't understand them or appreciate them. And that brings us to the issue of compromise. And here, the fairly obvious fact is that espousing a formula like my way or the highway is probably the single fastest way to push just about any love relationship into the maw of disaster. That's also why it's practically impossible to have a successful love relationship with an inveterate narcissist. That is, with someone who consistently puts his or her own self-interest before anything else in life. The fact is that successful love relationships almost always involve a fair amount of give and take and ongoing negotiation, which in turn requires 2 things. First, an ability to communicate freely and effectively, and then a degree of self-awareness. Of course, the ability to communicate is not a skill that everyone possesses in equal measure. However, it's important to do the best we can anyhow. That's because making a bona fide attempt at least conveys the fact that we care enough to try, which itself is an act of kindness, a way of trying to give something even when our abilities make it difficult to do so. Self-awareness, in turn, is necessary because it's important to know when we should be compromising and when we shouldn't. But that's probably not going to happen if we're not able to know our own hearts well enough to perceive when something is truly important and consequential to us. And that brings us to the realm of shared experience. Basically, I'd say that success in love relationships also depends upon our ability to share the journey of life with our partners. And in my experience, it's quite a bit easier to do that when we have some shared interests in common. For instance, Mrs. Dodson and I share an avid interest in, well, many things. such as meditation, physical fitness, learning Spanish, playing video games, and practicing archery. We're both musicians and students of psychology and philosophy, and we're both very much interested in spirituality, both in theory and in practice. Of course, we also have our own distinct areas of interest. For instance, I have an abiding interest in mathematics, and I love to play chess, neither of which fascinates Mrs. Dodson very much. And she is a total Scrabble hound, which is not my particular cup of tea. But the point is that we both find it an incredible blessing to have found another person with whom we can share a lot of life and ultimately enjoy the overall journey together. And so, over time, I've come to regard that as a vital part of a successful relationship. However, I'd say that another, very much related element has to do with expressing appreciation and gratitude for our partners, for the qualities they possess that enhance our lives and bring us joy. Basically, that's important because it's a way of celebrating our lives together and helping us feel the real value of our love relationships. Furthermore, without expressing and celebrating the appreciation we feel for one another, it's all too easy to take each other for granted and to lose the sense of excitement and joy in our relationships, which can then degenerate into the kind of boredom I described in my last video, the one about why our love relationships fail. And expressing appreciation and gratitude doesn't necessarily have to be something high-flown or grandiloquent. For instance, just the other day, I said to my wife as we were returning from the gym, "You know one thing I love about you? You get me to exercise on the days when I would probably just weasel out of it." And yeah, that might not seem like a big deal. But on the other hand, most of the time we probably underestimate the power of small acts of appreciation and gratitude, because often the small ones are the most important ones of all. And that brings us to what I think is probably the single most important, indispensable characteristic of successful love relationships. Basically, successful love relationships are the ones where our time together brings out the best in each other. The ones that really help us grow and develop as human beings and allow our highest and most noble selves to come to the fore. Basically, the ones that make us better people all the way around. And when you think about it, well, what are our love relationships really for, if not that? Sure, at a more immediate level, they're about things like allaying our loneliness and satisfying our sexual appetites, but if at some point they don't draw us toward the deeper, more luminous regions of life itself, well, we can probably start to wonder whether they're worth all the fuss and trouble. Of course, in the final analysis, I suppose that the same thing could be said of pretty much any other element of our lives, but in the case of our love relationships, it seems especially pointed and obvious. Well, at least it does to me. So, at this point, let's move toward ending this video by summarizing its main points. The question is, how do our love relationships succeed? In other words, what are the essential conditions and qualities that enable us to find genuine fulfillment in our love relationships and that sustain them over time? And my answer is that the first of those qualities is trust and trustworthiness, and then understanding, acceptance, and honesty. Beyond that, there's the issue of kindness, as well as our ability to compromise, communicate, and share the broad and varied experience of life with each other. In addition, it's also important to express our appreciation and gratitude for our partner's presence in our lives. And finally, I'd say that our love relationships depend a lot on how we manage to bring out the best in each other and simultaneously draw each other toward the deepest and most luminous regions of life itself. Of course, at this point, it's probably tempting to wonder about how we might embody those sorts of qualities more often in our love relationships. And probably the most tempting strategy would be to try to force ourselves to behave in those ways more than we already do. To act in ways that seem more kind and more understanding, for instance. But in my view, for the most part, taking that approach would be a mistake. That's because the real foundation of those sorts of elements isn't so much what we do, but how we are. And so forcing ourselves to act a certain way isn't such a great strategy. After all, I bet we've all had plenty of experience with forced kindness and false understanding, enough to know that they're miles away from the real thing. So I'd say that a much better strategy revolves around allowing ourselves to be better partners rather than trying to force it. That is, it has to do with allowing our better nature and our more noble souls to come to the fore more often, until they eventually become the main thing in our lives, the main way we move from moment to moment. And I sense that one of the best ways of going about that is to practice letting those qualities permeate our entire being whenever we experience them in the small moments of our lives. To savor those moments when they happen, and consequently, to let them teach us, little by little, what it really means to be human, until eventually the qualities that make our love relationships successful become natural and instinctive to us. Basically, our primary way of being, rather than something unnatural we have to force ourselves to do. But like I said in the beginning of this video, maybe that's just me, and your own results and your own experience might be very different from mine, and it's perfectly okay if that's true. But in any case, thanks so much for listening, and as always, take care of your soul.